Usually on Sunday evening, sometimes on Monday, I read the gospel passage for the following Sunday, so that through the week I can be thinking about, praying about, seeking examples of what I'm going to speak to you about on Sunday. Sometimes it's Monday I get to it, sometimes Tuesday, and I'm really honest, sometimes I don't get to it until Wednesday. But I always try to do it early in the week. If you paid really close attention to this particular gospel, you'll know that this whole week I've been living with a very tough gospel. A very tough gospel to proclaim, a tough gospel for us to hear, a tough gospel for us to be challenged by, not easy. Jesus says, almost as a refrain throughout the gospel, you cannot be my disciple. If you're this, you cannot be my disciple. A third time, you cannot be my disciple. And then we remember at the beginning, we're told by Jesus, unless you hate your mother, your father, your son, your daughter, your relative, your friend, you cannot be my disciple. It's hard to live with that gospel. And it's exactly right. It's exactly right. Jesus doesn't always tell us the butterflies of life. We'd like to hear Jesus as the gentle good shepherd. We'd like to think of Jesus as the babe lying in the manger at Christmas. We like to think of Jesus as a best friend who walks with us throughout life. Jesus tells us that sometimes he can be pretty tough on us in order to move us forward. In order to move us forward as disciples of Jesus. The whole goal of our life is to be a disciple of Jesus so that in the end of life we'll be ready for heaven. The whole goal of our commitment as disciples of Jesus is to prepare us for that judgment day, to get us ready to present to God in judgment a wonderful life, a life lived fully as a disciple of Jesus. And so these hard words today, we hear them from St. Luke's Gospel. What was going on? So the apostles had been with Jesus for 3 years. They walked up Calvary with Jesus. They saw him die on the cross. They saw him resurrected from the dead incredibly, and they said goodbye as he ascended into heaven. In those initial years afterwards, remember that Jesus did not leave a catechism to which to follow. He did not leave a creed summarizing what we are to believe in. The church had to grow into all those things. Jesus didn't leave the church alone, but gave the gift of the Holy Spirit to be with the Holy Church, to help the church be more holy, to help individuals be disciples of Christ. What Luke found in some of the communities was a very divided community. On one part, there were these people who thought they knew everything. They thought they were better than everyone else, maybe because they had actually heard Jesus, maybe they saw him work a miracle. Something in their life made them think that they were better than everybody else, more faithful, better than every other disciple. Then on the other hand, Luke was also dealing with people who were very lukewarm in the faith. They were just not making the connection of how to live as a disciple of Jesus. They could pray it, they could use the words, but they weren't living it. They weren't living it. And so St. Luke had to find a way to remind the people of his time and remind all of us that no one has all of the answers, that all of us are on pilgrimage together, and that all of us are called not to be lethargic in our faith, not just to use the words of prayer, especially just once a week, but to bring that prayer, that hope to our lives each and every day, to live our faith. This past week, we had the celebration of the feast of St. Teresa of Calcutta, probably know her better, Mother Teresa of Calcutta. How can you not like her? She is wonderful. She's not imposing. She was less than 5 feet tall. She's not incredible in her words. She's just very simple and down to earth. She doesn't pretend to be a theologian. She is, if you look at pictures of her or remember her, she's a wrinkly old Albanian grandmother looking lady. She stands really small. Look at her hands. They're crippled with arthritis. Look through her sandals. You see her feet were crippled with arthritis. She wasn't perfect in physical structure. But boy, could she be a disciple of Jesus, right? Could she be a disciple of Jesus? She lived the faith each and every day. I remember reading that when she left her convent in Calcutta, one of the poorest sections in the world, she left it with a rosary in her hand. She walked out the door with her rosary in her hand. And what I picture is she started the first decade, the first 10 Hail Marys, and then came across someone who asked for her advice because someone was sick. Then she'd pick up the rosary and go do another few prayers. And then she'd come across someone laying in the street who needed help just washing his face for the day because he couldn't lift himself up. He was so sick. And then she went on. She integrated her life and her faith together. She lived as a disciple of Jesus. But remember the opening lines of today's gospel. Unless you hate your mother, your father, your brother, your sister. How did that occur in her life? She was a missionary. She left Albania to go to a completely separate country, completely separate language, completely separate culture, completely knew everything. She put Jesus first. That's what she taught, to put Jesus first. That's how we can understand this gospel. That's how we can live this gospel, putting Jesus first. During the Second World War, there was a theologian in Germany, and he stood up against the atrocities being done by the German government, the Nazis. He stood up for them, for the poor, for the persecuted. So much so that he was put in jail for about 1.5 years, and at the end of which he was executed. He wrote a book. The title of the book was The Cost of Discipleship. The Cost of Discipleship. Makes you think a little bit. Makes you think a little bit of that gospel passage from Luke a couple weeks ago. A very wealthy young man came up to Jesus and said, "What do I need to do to achieve eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, what do you believe? What do you know? What have you been living?" And the man quoted him, "Well, the 10 Commandments. Love the Lord your God with your whole life, your whole self, your whole soul, your whole heart, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said, "Yep, you got it. You learned well. You're a good Jewish boy. You knew exactly what the answer to that was." And he said, "But I want to follow you." And Jesus says, if you want to follow me, then you have to go and sell all of your possessions and then come back and follow me. This man was very wealthy. His wealth was his identity. This is where he got his importance from. These are the friends that he had, other very wealthy people. The cost for him was to sell all his possessions to follow Jesus. To hate in a way those possessions that he had loved, that found his identity, his purpose for living, his sense of security, his hope for the future. Set all of that aside, Jesus said. For you, that's the cost of your discipleship. And so we see then the pattern that the church is showing us. That these difficult words that we hear need to be applied to our own lives, each in our own way, because someone else cannot tell you or me what the cost of discipleship is for me. It's a very personal thing. For Jesus reminds us that because we are disciples, his disciples, everything looks different. Everything in the world is different because we're willing to put Jesus first, before family and friends, before wealth and opportunities, before our jobs, before everything else. If you really want to be a dedicated disciple of Jesus, this is what you have to do. Pay the cost. And so, the question is for you and for me, a very personal one. What is the cost that you pay for discipleship? If there's no cost, you're doing it wrong. We're just not living the faith as Jesus needs us to live it in order for him to truly love us, for him truly to energize us, for him truly to give us the hope that only he can give us, unless we're willing to put him first. What is the cost? There is a cost. We can't be like that one half of the people that Luke was dealing with who were lukewarm in their faith. That's not discipleship. We can say we're disciples of Jesus. We can now and then pray like we're disciples of Jesus, but unless we're living it, unless there's a cost involved, we're not paying the price. And it's not a price of money. It's a price of life, of perspective, of truly being willing to open our hearts and our lives to Jesus more and more each day, so that we can echo Paul's words one day. It is no longer I who lives, Paul said, but Christ who lives in me. There's a reason he's a saint. There's a reason why Teresa of Calcutta is a saint. They found that key. They were willing to pay that price. They were willing to hate instead of be clinging to things that don't last, even relationships that don't last, in order to put Christ first. So, we can call ourselves disciples of Jesus, but please, be willing today, as you walk out of church, to have that question in your own mind, in your own heart. What am I willing to pay? What is the cost of discipleship for me? It's a very threatening question, because it'll lead us to change. It'll lead us to consider our lives, to look at our lives, to see if they're properly focused, and that is so challenging. It's so difficult because we can be very resistant to change. It's easier just to sit and be quiet. It's easier not to change anything. This is what I'm used to. It's easier just to go along to get along. But remember the tough words of today's gospel. Unless you do this, you cannot be my disciple. What is the this that's in our lives that's keeping us from being more dedicated, more in love with, more open to God's will in our lives? There's the cost of discipleship for you and for me. We ask the Lord today then for the strength, the hope, the optimism that will come for us, each and every one of us, when we ask ourselves that question, what am I